Northern Wetland Stream Restorations. And our speaker is Tracy Hames, who is the director of the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. Tracy is a wildlife biologist by training and inclination, waterfowl. And he got a job after getting his master's degree at UW Stevens Point. He got a job for 9 years out on, I think it's, what? 22 years, but he got fired after 9 years. What was that? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Anyway, this job was on, is it the largest Indian reservation in the country, or at least in the Northwest? Okay, Yakima. And he went out there to promote ducks and maybe restore marshes and that sort of thing. But if you're in the Pacific Northwest and you're dealing with water, you're going to find out about salmon and trout because they're in those streams. So he had experience with them, and then he came back. He wanted to get back home to the Midwest. He's from Minnesota originally. And so he got the job with the Wetlands Association here. And he got involved with our workshop on streams. And this guy loves to learn about things. He deals with wetlands, but he gets in the streams with me, and he plotches around, and he's curious, and he finds out all sorts of things all on his own. Really appreciate the help he's been in getting this workshop going the last few years. He's going to play a big role next year when our topic is beaver. So anyway, we're going to hear now, as several times before, about wetlands, but this time particularly with respect to the north. Tracy.
So I wonder, I'm a little scared of this remote. Would it be okay to give the talk by the computer? Went it at that. All right. Not at the screen, really? Well, who would have thought? All right. So we've had some great talks, really high level, detailed talks. The intellectual part of this room knows way up here. I'm going to bring it way down there. So like Ray said, a lot of my work is occurred over the years as a land manager. I've lived with tens of thousands of acres of floodplains and floodplain reconnection for my life. I got mud under my fingernails, and a lot of the stuff that the other folks were talking about, I had to learn, through experience. And when I hear these talks, and it makes me feel so good because what these people are saying matches the experience I had actually on the ground. So this has been such a great last few days here. So we're talking a little bit about wetlands and how are wetlands important for trout. And so let's dive on in and we'll see if we can make this. Look at that, first try. First, I always like to start out with what are wetlands. So if you talk to a wetland scientist, they'll give you all kinds of complicated explanation of what wetlands are, involving soil and water and vegetation and this and that. Really, oftentimes, what we need to remember about wetlands is that wetlands are the places in between the areas that are always dry and the areas that are always wet. And because they're in that zone, wetlands can be very different. Some are closer to the always dry, some are closer to the always wet. They change seasonally. Everything happens differently from one wetland to another. So when we think about wetlands, think about incredibly dynamic and changing and diverse systems. So how do wetlands help manage cold water? So we're going to talk about two wetland regions today. We're going to start talking about upper watershed wetlands, the wetlands in the top of the watershed, and floodplain wetlands, and wetlands along the waterways, of course. So it's really important when you're thinking about things like trout or ducks or any kind of water-related subjects, thinking about the watershed, right? Where's your water flow? All watersheds are different. They function different. We learned about the geology, we learned about the biology, all the different things that influence the movement of water through our watersheds, whether it be surface flow or groundwater flow. So it's really important as we're out working in these streams, working in these areas, that we understand the context. And the previous talks really helped us to see the importance of understanding the context within which we're working. Unfortunately, as humans, and all too often in natural resources, we want to have recipe book approaches to things. And just tell me what kind of technique to use, where, here, there, or there. And unfortunately, that's not the way we need to do things. We have to do the homework and understand the context within which we're working. This simplified picture here shows, oftentimes in the upper portions of watersheds, and these are forested or not, but certainly in forested, you'll have abundant wetlands high up, and then those work their way down into the channels, the mid area, floodplains, taking the overflow water and doing all the things that Ellen talked about and others, and then of course the lower watershed. So when we're thinking about this, I want to emphasize these two things: what's going on upstream, what's happening above us, and what's happening within our streams and along the floodplains to help keep those systems healthy. And when you're taking watershed approach, thinking about, Ellen talked a lot about legacy, thinking about the legacy. How did this place function historically? How did the water move historically? What have we done to change things? And what can we do to understand how things functioned before and move things back towards that direction in a modern context? And the modern context is sometimes the most important part of that, because we're oftentimes not able to take out roads and reservoirs and lots of other things that are influencing how water moves through our watersheds. Uh-oh, didn't go that. Oh, there it did. So let's start with the upper watershed. This is a photo in Wisconsin, the Pinocchio Hills up near Ashland, and a forested landscape. You can see a couple of big wetlands here. This is the tippy top of the Bulgus watershed. I'll show several pictures from that watershed. Class 1 trout stream, Bulgus Creek. What you don't see in this photo is most of the wetlands. In amongst all these trees is almost a 50% wetland landscape. And what they are is ephemeral ponds mostly. This area receives 200, sometimes 250 inches of snow every winter. And where's all that water going to go? It gets collected by these ephemeral wetlands up here at the top of the watershed. That allows that water to soak slowly down into the ground, work its way towards the creek for base flow, et cetera, et cetera. These are a couple of beaver dams, and we'll talk a little bit about those beaver dams later on. But what's happened in so many of our watersheds, and I don't just mean agricultural watersheds, but certainly in ag areas, we've removed these upper watershed wetlands. We've lost our ability of our watersheds to hold on to this, 80% of the water, they say, comes in the upper part of it. Where's it going out? Rushes down into our creeks through ditches, through drain tiles, up here in this area through gullies that occurred after the clear cut, et cetera, et cetera. And we're not holding on to that water anymore in the upper part of the watershed. What's that do? That provides flashy flows moving downstream. We lose our base flow, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes people neglect to be thinking about the upper portion of our watershed and these simple ephemeral ponds that are doing so much work maintaining the health. Here's a picture of a beaver dam, but once again, in the upper watershed, holding this stuff on, slowly releasing it, reducing the energy and the quantity and the timing of the water movement through our watersheds. This is an ephemeral pond after it's dried up. So come up in this area in May and these things are all full of water. A few years back in 2016, they had 15 inches of rain overnight in this location. Once again, some of these climate-induced rain events that we seem to be experiencing lately all over the state. Well, one hit right here in July. All these ephemeral wetlands. I was up there 4 days after that rain event. Every one of them that had been previously like this, mudflats, were chock full of water. All that water was held up in there. A few beaver dams breached a little bit, but they patched it up. And downstream, the river was running nice and clean very little damage in this watershed, where other places where the wetlands had been lost and the floodplains had been disconnected. One rain event, $35 million just in public infrastructure damage. So incredibly damaging to the region, very disruptive to everything. But Bulgus Creek, no problem at all. In a big part, thanks to the wetlands. Okay, I clicked it again. Did it work? Let me try it one more time. There we go. Here's some of the channels that run through. It's a pretty steep watershed. When I go out into a forested environment and see these kinds of channels, this is an ephemeral channel, flows during snow melt and spring rains. And look at that, nice and easy. There's a little bit of wood in there, but you know, there's not fish using this channel. It's a runoff channel. Very low energy. And this is low energy because of the abundance of wetlands in the upper portion of this watershed here. Many places, forested environments in the north as well, where we've lost our wetlands or ditched them. This would be a 4 or 5 foot gully through the forest. When you see these types of channels, these types of water delivery features, it really makes me happy because I know there's abundant and healthy wetlands on the landscape. And of course, the water soaks into the ground, works through the ground, takes time, and eventually gets expressed as base flow in springs in the hot time of the year. As Ray said, we experience tropical conditions here in the summer in Wisconsin. Dew points in the 70s are tropical. We're a tropical region with a really good disguise 9 months of the year. So we're not having trout unless we're getting water into our trout streams from the ground, right? And so this is an example that when you see that sheen in a wetland, that means the water's coming up out of the ground. There's processes that go on. Looks kind of like oil. A lot of times people think it's oil on the water, but that means upwelling water in wetlands through wetland soils. So that keeps the water clean and cold, and the ground acts like a refrigerator. We always say, you know, the snow melt goes into the ground cold, it goes back out several months later into the creek cold, and that's what allows the fish to survive. So wetlands are a big part of that process. If we take our water that should be soaking into the ground and we pour it down ditches, pour it into the channel, we lose our water, right? We spend all our water budget within a couple of months, and by June, July, August, creeks dry. Flow persists during late summer, just like that. Maintaining good quality and quantity. Of course, those wetlands, there's a lot of stuff going on to help clean the water, especially in agricultural landscapes where we have nitrates and other things. Wetlands are excellent at helping process those nutrients and other things. Try it again. Oh, now I'm starting to experience the other. Did I jump a slide? Let's see. Yeah, should be. There we go. So healthy floodplains. Let's talk a little bit about floodplains. Another feature of Wisconsin is that not only have we lost so much of our upper watershed wetlands, we've disconnected our floodplains in a big, big way. And once again, not just in agricultural landscapes, but in other areas as well. And remember, runoff is the enemy of trout, right? The more we can slow that runoff down, get it into the ground, the better off we are. Upper watershed wetlands reduce that runoff, the impact of runoff on the water. Oh man, the creeks we've been visiting the last couple of days, you know, they hardly rise and fall at all because there's so many good wetlands and features on the landscape that reduce that flashiness, reduce that rushing of water into our creeks and channels. So it's beautiful. Anyways, floodplains are a big part of keeping the health, especially when you've lost your upper watershed wetlands or you've disturbed things and you have flashy flows coming down. We need a healthy floodplain to spread that water out and to reduce that energy. Here's a picture of what a lot of our floodplains in Wisconsin used to look like. Here's a sedge meadow with a windy channel, several channels, a bunch of spring brooks coming off it, winding through its way. This was a lot of the driftless looked like this area historically, doesn't anymore. But when the floods come, say there is a flashy event, these things truly do act like sponges and hold on to that water and slowly release it. Well, let's see how. There we go. Here's a hydrograph from my old job where I used to work out in eastern Washington state. This is the Yakima River, which is a mountain-based river watershed that flows from the crest of the Cascades eastward down into the valley. And here's a hydrograph in a place called Parker and a hydrograph in Grandview. And you can see on the bottom is the dates. This was early January in 2009. Well, what happened during this time is there was a lot of snowpack in the mountains, and we had a big warm front. A Pineapple Express came in off the Pacific, dumped rain on top of all that snow. When that happens in mountain landscapes, it all comes rushing downstream, right? And so we had one of those events in 2009. And the blue line here, you can see that's the gauge at a place called Parker. And up above Parker is an urban area and a bunch of channelized area, no floodplain for about quite a few miles. And we're about 100 miles down the river at this location. So all this water is coming down, confined into a channel. And the hydrograph at Parker went from about 2,000 cubic feet per second up to, what's that, about 32,000 in one day, and then dropped really fast, right, back down. That was a big slug of water that came through Parker all at once. Well, look at Grandview's hydrograph. Grandview, believe it or not, is 30 miles downstream from Parker. Look at the way the flood behaved there. Slowly rose. It rose about 30% less than it did at Parker, and then it dropped down slowly, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's going on? Well, how can you have a lower hydrograph, a more smooth hydrograph at Grandview than Parker downstream? Plus, there's two tributaries entering the river between those two. The answer is floodplains. This is the area I work between these two cities. Very broad, healthy, multi-channeled, well-vegetated floodplain with wetlands wall to wall. And that water got past Parker, just spread out into that floodplain, soaked in, slowly worked its way down. The impact at Grandview was much less than it was at Parker. When you work in floodplains, when you experience these things, it really, really makes an impression on you, the power of healthy floodplains at reducing energy and reducing flood peaks and all the good things they do for our river corridors. So always be thinking about that. Are there opportunities where we can reconnect the floodplain? And it's friction. A lot of the floodplains work, Ellen talked about messy floodplains, right? It's all that vegetation and all that wood and all that stuff out on the floodplain that slows that water down, spreads it out, allows it to soak in, interact with the hyporheic zone, all that good stuff we've talked about. But you got to have space to do that, right? You have to have a place where the water can spread out. And it's really important because in Wisconsin, we talk a lot, sometimes a little loosely about floodplains, especially when we're talking about trout restoration. Floodplains are flat. No, this thing doesn't show up. Why do I have to say that? Well, of course they're flat, aren't they? Because in Wisconsin, so many times we hear people when they're doing a riprap project in an eroded bank, they'll pull the bank back 45 degrees and they'll say, we reconnected the floodplain, as if cutting a bank back at an angle reconnects the floodplain. That ain't the floodplain. That's a pulled back bank. By pulling the banks back, you're actually making the floodplain less connected because you're increasing the surface cross section of the channel. It takes more water to get out on the flats. And it's when water gets out on the flats when the good things happens. Floodplains are flat. Write that down, kids. And they're also really wet. A healthy floodplain, you will have a hyporheic zone, you will have the river up closely connected with it, and it holds a lot of water in there. Just a portion of your water is actually in the channel itself. And as Ellen so well said, they are very, very messy. And that's not just important for all the things she talked about, but it's also really important for wildlife habitat as well. So, and floodplains have healthy side channel wetlands. When you have a healthy floodplain, it's a wet place. There are a lot of wetlands out there. There will be islands, upland areas, there'll be forested areas, there'll be even grasslands in healthy floodplains, but there's a lot of wetlands and they got a lot of stuff like this, wood and other things in there because they're messy. And from a trout standpoint, that's also important for these guys, right? Well, not necessarily, well, yeah, there'll be hexes formed in this because that's kind of silty stuff, but a lot of bugs are coming out of these places. So when you have healthy connected side channels, wetlands, etc., you're increasing the bugs associated with that waterway. Anybody know this guy, by the way? That's Bill Hart. Anybody know Bill Hart in this room? Yeah. Floodplains influence channel form. So you've seen this picture already. I forgot your name already. Nick. Nick showed this picture. I was like, hey, where did he get my picture? I asked him, he says he got it off the internet. Anyways, I took this picture in, I think, about 2014. This is Bulgus Creek, class 1 trout stream. Big sedge meadow running about 3/4 of the way up Bulgus Creek. This was a July day. I was walking out through this, no kidding, tussock sedge meadow that the tussocks were almost neck high. And try walking through that stuff one time. And I was probably knee deep in water getting to the channel. And there was several channels at different elevations through this sedge floodplain. But I got to the channel, I thought, oh good, this is going to be great. I'm going to be able to stand in the channel and take a nice picture of this floodplain, you know, et cetera. So I took one step and whoosh, right up to my neck in water. And I'm an old duck hunter. Last thing that it gets wet is your gun. So the camera did not get wet. So I pulled myself out and stood on the bank and took this photo. But it was really exciting because what do we got here? We've got a deep, narrow channel that you can jump across, and overhanging bank. The sedges and the grass have fibrous roots. They provide that overhead. The trout can hide under there. The wetland, I mean, all this stuff was working together and creating this really nice trout habitat. And if you removed this wetland, you wouldn't have this. If you removed the upper watershed wetlands from here, you couldn't have this. Why? Because the water would flush down and the channel would have to accommodate those high flows. And to accommodate the high flows, it makes itself larger and oftentimes wider and shallower, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an indication of healthy wetlands upstream and floodplain conditions here, an incredible wildlife and fish habitat, and also deer fly habitat. So we've really changed the way water flows across our landscapes in Wisconsin, right? Historic cutoff, we learned a lot about that. All the roads and things we've been putting in, changing the way water moves, upper watershed conversion, wetlands especially. You go to our agricultural landscapes, we've lost in most cases almost all of our upper watershed wetlands because those were the easiest ones to ditch and farm. All those little abundant, you know, ephemerals and potholes have been lost, and that water has to go somewhere else. So a lot of our wetlands in the lower portions of some of these watersheds are actually wetter than they were historically because we dump all that water down. Drainage, channelization, wetland floodplain loss, and climate change. We're experiencing every year in Wisconsin, somewhere we get these large storms where it'll come in about 8 o'clock at night, dump a foot of rain on one location, then move on. And doesn't seem like any part of the state has been spared this. So people say, oh, these problems are because of climate change. Yes, they are, but it's climate change on top of an already really messed up landscape. So we've got to start working not only to reduce the effects of climate change, but to make our landscapes more resilient. And every time these floods come, and I've seen it, these gullies form worse and worse and worse. They become less resilient to floods every time we run them through. I can take you to show you headcuts that move 5 feet every year after a big rain. They're still unraveling. So our communities are flooding. Come on. There we go. Our streams are running dirty. These are 2 adjacent watersheds that flow into Lake Superior. The one on the left, guess what? Abundant wetlands in the upper watershed. The one on the right, they've been lost. Pretty obvious. These pictures were taken 45 minutes apart on an April day. Our communities are suffering. So not only is our fish and wildlife habitat in trouble, this is the town of Ashland in Ashland County. 75% of their annual town budget goes to road repair on a normal year. You bring a big storm over top of it, and this is what happens. We're blowing things out in a big way. And so if we're going to be restoring our communities and the health of our communities, we've got to start thinking about water movement through the watershed and how wetlands can be a part of the solution to that. And that's a big part of the way we work right now. I'm a duck biologist. You guys are trout biologists. I don't talk about ducks much. If we're going to restore these, the problems we have statewide for trout and ducks and everything else, we've got to do it at a large scale, and we'll never get to scale if our approach to conservation and outreach is just working with people that like ducks and trout and frogs and pretty flowers. We'll never get enough work done on the ground. So a lot of the work we do is going into communities and helping them understand why wetland restoration is important to the things they already care about. Town of Ashland cares about their water budget. I ain't talking about ducks and trout with them. I'm talking about, you know, maintaining the health of their roads. It's the only way we're going to get to scale. We don't need hundreds or thousands of wetland acres back in Wisconsin. We need hundreds of thousands of wetland acres back. We've lost half of the wetlands. We had 10 million acres originally in Wisconsin. That's a wet foot every 3 steps, right? You can't remove half of your wetlands without serious implications to the other resources. So we've got a lot of work to do to get them back, and we're not going to just do it approaching conservation with the people that care about conservation. Come on. There we go. Here's a nice sedge meadow, or it was. Up above this is a impervious surface and a culvert overwhelming the wetland, so it can't, now it's incising. You see its head cutting up through this wetland. Well, what's just below this? Turn the camera around and what do you see? This. And this is the top of the watershed here. It gets worse down the line. This is actually in the driftless area. But I'd like to show that the power of water. And this is still eroding. I don't know if you can tell, but this stuff is still slumping off these banks. So it's still head cutting actively as we speak. Next one. There we go. This is a really common occurrence in Wisconsin. This obviously is a mountainous illustration from my previous job, but we've done this throughout many places in Wisconsin, forested or agriculture, where we've had a big, broad floodplain, the kind of stuff that Ellen was talking about. We don't like that, right? We wanted to farm it or graze it or do whatever. So we take the creek and we push it to the edge of the floodplain, levee it out, and then we can develop or do whatever we want in a place that previously was wet. And that does all the bad things that Ellen was talking about, right? You dry your hyporheic zone, all the energy coming down the channel, you can't spread it out anymore. So it starts cutting itself deeper, on and on and on and on. We've really got to be looking at these situations and saying, how can we find the opportunities to get these floodplains reconnected in these places? Very common. Come on. Seems like it gets worse as the talk goes on, doesn't it? So here's another area. Ellen talked about the mill pond deposition. We've got a lot of that throughout Wisconsin as well. Here's a creek where we've had deposition. So we farm these areas, or we put in a mill pond, and all that dirt comes in over top of what used to be a sedge floodplain, sedge meadow like the one we showed earlier, and it buries it under several feet of alluvium or sediments. That reduces the ability of the river then to interact with its floodplain, right? It takes a bigger flood before that spreads out. So what does the channel do? Not only can't it interact with this floodplain because of the deposition, it starts digging itself deeper in many cases because it needs a larger cross section to handle that flow that's going through there. Those are like fire hoses downstream. That's when roads start blowing out. So we have the deposition and the incision. So we can either, like Ellen said, either drop the floodplain back down or lift the river back up, or a combination. And I will maintain in Wisconsin, this is such a common occurrence. If we're going to get to scale and get the floodplains back we need, it's going to be hard to dig out all that dirt, because where are we going to put it? Is it cost effective to do that? I'm a much bigger proponent to say this is the new normal. These are our new floodplain elevations. Maybe we need to lift our creeks up. And we'll talk a couple about how some ways we can do that. So Oh, by the way, and there's an active head cut still going on right here. See this? This creek is still down cutting as we speak because of the concentrated flows when the waters come. So think about this kind of stuff. I think about it as a catastrophic situation. So if you're in a mountain watershed and a landslide comes down and comes over top of your creek or river, right? Nobody goes in and says, oh, we need to dig that landslide out to restore that. That's the new normal, right? That's an act of God. So the river has to go around that landslide fan. Same thing in Wisconsin. This happened over a couple decades. This is just like a catastrophic situation. So maybe we need to be thinking about, is this the new normal? Are there ways of dealing with this differently? We've also, because of wetland loss and other action, you know, the ditching and whatever, the flashy floods also, here's an example where it's an overwidened and a shallowed creek that also doesn't seem like it's disconnected with the floodplain, but it really is because of the width of that channel. The other way to connect it is to narrow that down, as some earlier talks talked about trying to narrow back these channels, but then you have to get the right vegetation to make that work as well. So how do we turn all this stuff around? Ellen said it much more eloquently than I did, but we need the right amounts of the right actions in the right locations. The problem with conservation is we'll have a program, wetland money or something. Hey, I've got some wetland money. Who wants to sign up? And our wetland money goes to the people that love ducks or whatever. It's randomly applied. We need to get much smarter and come up with ways of looking at our watersheds, looking at, you know, where the right amounts of the right things can be done to realistically and cost effectively deal with the situations we're in. And, you know, we use the term hydrologic restoration a lot. So it's you know, I always say fix the water, get the hydrology working again. And it's important to remember, understand the legacy, understand how the place functioned, what we've changed, how can we bring back some semblance of that, using the history as an important guide in a modern context. In the modern context, the most important part of that. Now we can, you know, we can start addressing head cut, gullying and stuff, stabilizing those things, simple things we can do. This is, I don't know if this is the best example of restoration, but this is one place where they did dig out some of the sediment. I don't know if they had riprap in there or not, but it's an early, this is soon after that. So don't use this as a great example, but it does show where they dug out some of the alluvium. Or you can narrow the channel. This is a Little Plover River where a lot of things happened, but one of the things, a lot of the things that happened with the flashy flows was to make this channel 30 to 40 foot wide and about shin deep in a sandy environment where historically, according to the 1853 surveys, it was 5.5 feet wide. By narrowing this channel now, we allow the creek to interact with the floodplain at about a 15 CFS flow, whereas when it was out of whack, it was interacting with the floodplain at a 70 CFS flow. So really, really happy. We narrowed it with the brush bundles. Yeah. Where do we get the brush bundles from? Oh, here's a picture of Dominique standing in what used to be shin deep water with a narrowed channel. Now this guy's 6'4", so that's thigh deep. So, and guess what? With the narrowed channel now, it used to be all sand. Now there are gravels. He's standing on gravel right now because the flow is concentrated and it allows the gravels to be emerged. So sometimes riparian forest thinning is important. And this is Little Plover River again. I'll go back to this. And what happened in Little Plover River, this is why there's no recipe book approaches, right? Here it was important to remove the trees. Well, why on earth? Well, once again, Little Plover River is groundwater fed, comes out of the base of the moraine just southeast of Stevens Point. And historically, there was a 300-acre wetland right at the base where the spring waters came out and slowly then trickled out and fed the river. Well, a lot of things happened. We started irrigating and pumping water out of the ground, lowering the groundwater level. We put a bunch of ditches in to dry out that wetland. And what that caused and then the channel became wide because of those ditches, because it was allowing flashy flows to come down and get the channel out of whack. Then the trees grew up because the place was drier. It was a big sedge grass meadow historically, but it got dry enough where the trees were allowed to grow, and there were never trees there historically. And then the channel was wide and the alders grew in on the side. And remember, the alders have big roots. They don't hold the bank well, right? That helped facilitate the widening of that channel. So the decision was made. We had to do several things in conjunction, because if we just would have done one of them, it wouldn't have solved the problem. We had to remove the ditches that were causing the flashiness. We had to reduce the amount of pumping so we can get the water back up. And we had to pull those trees out and get rid of the alder to allow sunlight in there, rehydrate that area. Now these green plants, this is the first summer after thinning, or the first spring. This is all skunk cabbage, and marsh marigold grew in as well. And then you can see the brush bundles were a lot of the brush that was cut, tied them up, and then they put actually sod over it. Now it's all filled in with sediment, and it's really creating its own banks now, and we're very happy about this. This wouldn't persist if we only would have done one or two things. We'd have to keep going back and back and back. By addressing the problems, the changes that occurred, we are able to, we hope, and we think so, and so far so good, make this place much more sustainable. And sometimes you got to keep the old ones though, right? Yeah. Oh, I'm talking about trees. So that was taken a couple weeks ago out at one of the spots. Let's see if I can get this to the next one. Oh, they're too far. I'm almost done, folks. And saturated riparian zone. We've been to so many great trout streams, and in so many of these forested trout streams, what did we see? We saw something like this, a sedge meadow right next to a very small creek in a pretty heavily forested area, right? Well, the trees were actually less dense in these areas than they were when you get to the upland portion of it, because it's too wet for a lot of trees to grow. So the sedges were able to grow, et cetera. You could stick your foot way underneath these banks, and really good conditions. So, it's once again, get away from recipes and look at the situation you're in and adjust your activities appropriately. Okay, come on. Oh, there we go. You're right. It goes like 3 times if you hit it twice. There you go. And right again, just like Alan said, keep them messy, right? This is the upper channels of the Little Plover River that used to go dry by now this time of year, and just all kinds of wood and junk in there, and it's really neat. So gorgeous, and all the way it changes the form of the flow of the water, et cetera. So, I mean, there's gravels up here now in places that used to be, an inch deep because of the ditching and et cetera. So. Once again, we talked about reconnecting floodplains by reversing incision. We have a lot of things in Wisconsin that we call vortex weirs that we've made for wildlife or fish habitat. I use these types of structures out west to actually reverse incision. They're real simple, but you got to use bigger rock. And this is what they looked like on Topnish Creek. Topnish Creek was incised. It was very flat, historically anastomosed, but it had been ditched and the water dropped and incised, et cetera. This creek would go from 24 CFS base flow to, on a good flood, 24,000. Big, broad floodplain. And so we wanted to reconnect that floodplain. Well, the beavers would move in and they'd put a dam in, and the next spring, boom, they'd blow out. They couldn't keep a dam in that area. So what we ended up doing is putting in these rock structures. They look just like vortex weirs, but they allowed the water to raise the grade and the water to flow through. This is the most important steelhead producing watershed in the whole Yakima Basin. So it was important that we did this a way that the fish could get through. And these are each about 1.5 feet put in. So I will show you how the water flows through here real quick. This video was taken just a couple of years ago when I was out there duck hunting. Good duck hunting on this property as well as steelhead. So it flows down over this, creates a little pool. And in this area, we actually raised the creek 4 feet with 2 structures. and then it goes into there and on its way. And any baby fish can go upstream or down with no problem. And an adult, there's no restriction at all on this. So when we put these in, we lifted it up just a little bit where it was able to impact the floodplain. Then the A team moved in. Well, what's the A team? The beavers. Oh my God, there are abundant beavers all through here now, but they couldn't establish themselves until we gave them a little nudge, a little help. And in this situation, we used rock instead of wood. That's used in other areas. So it worked really good. It was very cost effective, easy to implement. This is what they look like, right? Here's the beaver dams. They do the same thing. And on rivers, a lot of times you'll see, and we'll talk about all this stuff next year, but on these run of the creek ones, you always have water flowing over the dam and through, and fish, can get in and out of there. We documented all this stuff with pit tag studies out there. There was no problem with any fish that wanted to go from here to there or there to there, no problem whatsoever. So oftentimes in these upper watershed beaver dams, well, I'll show you. In these ones, upper end of Bullgus Creek, these are 20-foot beaver dams at the bottom of these things. And what happens is they capture the sediment coming off. And you see, here's a dam here, here's a dam here, here's a dam here, and now there's a dam here. Beavers create dams because they need some depth of water for their lodges and et cetera. So they create the conditions. Well, eventually, even in healthy conditions, these things will start to fill up with sediment to the point that the beaver can't raise the dam high enough to have its water. So it moves down here. And then it again moved down here. So we're capturing sediment that would have otherwise gone into the class 1 trout stream. We're slowing the flow of water down, et cetera, et cetera. And when you go to the base of these dams, this is 20-foot dam here, there's no water flowing over top of that dam. Where's it going? It's bubbling out from beneath. It is so cool. And it's providing base flow right now. He's out there on Saturday. Just gorgeous stuff. And also management. So we're finding out that, we talked a lot about forest management along these streams. In agricultural areas, we're experimenting now with a lot of other things, and sometimes managed grazing, fire, all these things we're working towards now to keep the conditions healthy and to provide the natural functions that existed. Got a lot of work to do and a lot of things to learn, but it's really exciting times being involved in this. So that's it. Thanks so much. I hope I didn't go over time. That's it. If I went over time, it's break anyways, right?
Thanks very much, Tracy. Once again, I should have mentioned in introducing him that he and I were out with about 6 other people for the 2 days just passed, looking at over a dozen sites on streams, almost all of them here in northern Wisconsin. And all but one of those sites, I believe, had as its riparian area wetland, right? These are lowland streams. The banks and the riparian areas are soggy, and they're behaving in ways that Tracy has been talking about. So we've got to think of streams in terms of the wetlands that border them. And in that light, also his comments correspond with what I read you of the 1923 report by Thaddeus Surber, who wrote how important it was that wetlands were providing the water for the streams that were quickly recovering from deforestation. So all that fits. Now it's time for a break, and let's take 5 minutes longer than scheduled for the break because we've gone a little bit over, and let's be back at 3:25 instead of 3:20. Okay.